James Ogude is the director of the Center of the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, a position he's assumed in 2017, having been with the center since May 2013. He has just concluded a 5-year project on the Southern African philosophical concept of Ubuntu, funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and is currently leading a Mellon-funded supranational project involving the universities of Ghana, Makerere, Cape Town, and Pretoria. He's also the director of the African Observatory for Environmental Humanities, located at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. Until his appointment to the center, he was a professor of African literature and cultures in the School of Literature, Language, and Media Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, where he worked since 1994. His research interests include the broad areas of African literatures in English and post-colonial theories, with a specific focus on issues of memory and reconstruction of African history and identities. More recently, his research focus has shifted to popular cultures and literature in Africa in an attempt to understand how these cultures produced from below help us to understand issues of power and its uses on the continent. He's also working on the area of Black intellectual tradition, and his most recent edited books are Ubuntu and Personhood in 2018, Ubuntu and the Everyday, 2019, Ubuntu and the Reconstitution of Community, 2019. In addition, he has edited a number of books in literature and related areas, and I can't really mention everything in all articles and book chapters and everything. So to show how James Ogude works, let me just cite maybe a few words from a manifesto he published together with 10 other researchers in 2015. It's a manifesto, Humanities for the Environment, a manifesto for research and action. And I cite humanities disciplines such as philosophy, history, religious studies, gender studies, language and literary studies, psychology do offer deep insights into human motivation, values, and choices. We believe that the expertise of such fields for transforming human preferences, practices, and actions is ignored at society's peril. We propose an agenda that focuses global humanities research on stepping up to the challenges of planetary environmental change. We have established environmental humanities observatories through which to observe, explore, and enact the crucial ways humanistic disciplines may help us understand and engage with global ecological problems by providing insight into human action, perceptions, and motivations. All the observatories pursued a common question, and this might be also the question which is discussed all through the next 3 days. What is the role of the humanities in the age of the Anthropocene? And of course, please allow me to say James Ogude is a network thinker. And Ubuntu, in its broadest sense, is rooted in the belief that the full development of personhood comes with a shared identity and the idea that an individual's humanity is fostered in a network of relationships. Mr. Ogude, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking, Professor Niels Wittmann, a friend that I met, over 6 years ago in Vienna at a conference on transitional justice. And there I was giving a paper on Ubuntu. And I found these interventions to be extremely useful. And in the process, I decided to bring him on board on a project that I was running, a Templeton World Charity Foundation project on Ubuntu, and which went on for about 5 years. And Professor Wittmann was part of it. And that project produced 3 titles on Ubuntu. One of them is Ubuntu and Personhood. The other one, Ubuntu and the Everyday. And the third title was Ubuntu and the Reconstitution of Communities. And in all those 3 volumes, I found Professor Bateman's contribution very compelling. And those really, I don't consider myself one as a philosopher, but these 3 volumes are my claim to fame, if you wish. And as a result, I've been into a lot of trouble because people keep thinking that I'm a philosopher. I am basically a literary scholar by training. And so I always feel very uneasy in the company of philosophers like you. The majority of you are philosophers. And so if my paper today does not sound profoundly philosophical, you will understand. My comfort, though, is in the fact that literature deals with the story. Literature deals with narrative, and that the first cognitive tool ever given to man and woman was the story, was narrative. And in many ways, therefore, narrative and the story precedes most of the disciplines that, like philosophy. And my comfort, therefore, is that, human nature nexus is really accessible to us only through the story or through narrative. What I'm going to share with you today relates to Ubuntu, Nguni concept, philosophical concept, and what I consider as the principle of co-agency in African ecology that underpins it. I want to do a number of things which let me just spell out right from the beginning. One, I want to question in this paper the idea that African thought is predominantly anthropocentric. It's a very popular myth around African thought that is fundamentally human-centered. The second point that I want to make is that a number of African political thinkers, philosophers, and theologians have insisted that there is no divide between the human and the non-human, nature and culture in African thought. The third issue that I wish to pursue in this paper is that a number of African philosophical concepts, such as Kama among the Shona, Ubuntu among the Nguni communities in Southern Africa, Utu in East Africa, and Mat in Northern Africa, have also insisted on this interdependence and interrelatedness between humans and nature. Okay? I will then go on to use the example of Ubuntu and its principle of co-agency, and that is the dialectics between the human and other non-human, to illustrate my point that personhood, that Ubuntu philosophy encapsulates, is more than just person-to-person relationship, whereas Wittmann also intimated in his introduction that the Ubuntu philosophy and the idea of community is much broader and goes on to include the totality of the planetary universe as we know it. And finally, I want to linger on two issues because I think the question will come up and say, but what makes Ubuntu special? I'm not trying to suggest that it is special, but I'm trying to suggest that there's a sense in which Ubuntu offers us a critique, offers us possibilities of the future, that certain concepts, or if you like, certain schools of thought that have tried to look at the relationship between man and the environment have failed to fully flesh out. And I will be using Ubuntu, for example, to offer some critique of the deep eco-criticism that emerges from North America. Finally, I will also be using Beren's idea of moral considerability as one way of introducing the idea of co-agency, the idea of helping us to understand, indeed, how other elements, other non-human elements could be regarded as agents in their own rights. So if you don't get anything from what I'm going to read on, remember that those are the key issues I'm trying to raise in this lecture. They are broad strokes, I admit, but hopefully in looking at these broad strokes, one is hoping that I can stimulate some debate, among the participants. Let me start with a quote from Beren. Beren writes in relation to African thought. He says, there is a pervasive presumption that African thought is inherently anthropocentric and has little to contribute to environmental ethics. Against this view, a promising African environmentalism can be found in a belief in a fundamental interrelatedness between natural objects. What establishes moral considerability on this African view is that entities are part of the interconnected web of life. This position accords moral standing to all living things, groups of living things, as well as inanimate natural entities. This view, Beren adds, is not only plausible, but it is also theoretically appealing. I hope that as I go through my paper, I will be trying to convince you that the anthropocentric idea is in itself something that is alien, is in itself something that is embedded in African thought. And so I start. Over the years, there has been a persistent narrative that African philosophy is fundamentally anthropocentric. As a result, whenever philosophers are in search of an environmental ethic, they turn to the beliefs, values, and broad cultural practices of many societies. Africa never features. African thought, it is argued, could never yield any insight into ecological episteme or indigenous eco-philosophical values. A range of studies on the ecological ethical traditions of communities, while pointing to the presence of these traditions in other cultures have insisted that African thought merely gravitates around human interest. While making reference to African thought in his book entitled Earth's Insights, Callicott, for example, argues that, and I quote, one might expect to distill from it, that is African thought, no more than a weak and indirect environmental ethic. Beren tells us that the idea that African thought is essentially strongly anthropocentric and thus unable to make any meaningful contribution to an environmental ethic is indeed widespread. In spite of this commonly held belief, the African philosophy is inherently anthropocentric. A number of leading African writers and scholars, like Kwame Nkrumah, Leopold Senghor, and more recently, Wangai Maathai and Achille Mbembe, among others, have noted a strong anti-Cartesian logic in African thought and argue forcefully that the separation between humans and nature is indeed artificial. In Confucianism, Nkrumah offers a compelling critique of Western philosophies of humanity, indicting, for example, the Aristotelian and Cartesian insistence on human superiority based on rationality. Nkrumah rejects the Cartesian dualism that posits an immutable division between mind and body. And I quote, "The suspicion that living things exhibit non-apperceptive response is not new. Indeed, Descartes thought that the response of all non-human animals was non-perceptive. He therefore denied that non-human animals possess souls, remaining content to believe that all actions of such animals could be given a mechanical explanation, which is complete. But even humans are not entirely above non-appreciative response." End of quote. In a similar vein, Senghor writes that the West's separation of humans from the environment has resulted in the destruction of Earth. In Senghor's Africa, there is no separation between human beings and their environment. Senghor writes, and I quote, "A certain tree or animal from the local fauna or flora," he observes, is identified with the clan. And although African beliefs in totemism may appear unnatural to a Western observer, in Senghor's philosophy, what is really unnatural and inhuman is to isolate man from his environment to domesticate animal or tree, end of quote. It is therefore not surprising that Senghor was among the first modern African writers to mediate on non-human animals and to propose proper ways of relating to them. The political scientist Ali Masrui also characterized ancient African civilizations as making, and I quote, "no great distinction between the past, the present, and the future, and indeed no great distinction between the kingdom of God, the animal kingdom, the human kingdom." He adds, "the crocodile could be the god." More recently, the late environmental activist Wangari Maathai, suggested that the ecological crisis we are facing today could be reduced if we reanimate pre-colonial practices which are anchored in belief systems that protect the environment and animals. For Maathai, the boundary between the secular and the spiritual in African environmental conservation is fluid. Just the spiritual and material realities of the continent are intertwined. Achille Mbembe has gone further, but without confining his argument to Africa by suggesting that, and I quote Achille, humans are part of a very long, deep history that is not simply theirs. That history is vastly older than the very existence of the human race, which in fact is very recent. And they share this deep history with other forms of living entities and species. Our history is therefore one of entanglement with multiple other species. And this being the case, the dualistic partitions of minds from bodies, meaning and matter, or nature from culture, can no longer hold. End of quote from Achille. But Mbembe goes on to insert into this debate the concept of agency and power, arguing that these qualities have to be extended to non-human nature. And our conventional understanding of life as fundamentally dualistic in ways that privileges the human must be called into question, if not altogether disrupted. He writes, and I quote again, "To be a subject is no longer to act autonomously in front of an objective background, but to share agency with other subjects that have also lost their autonomy. We have to shift away from the dreams of mastery." End of quote. He argues that the world is indeed in need of a new understanding of ontology, epistemology, ethics, and politics that would allow us to overcome the anthropocentric view of the world that has created the artificial split between nature and culture. This anti-Cartesian view of the planetary Earth is one that is also shared by African theologians, who posit that one of the primary functions of African religious mythology is to reconcile our waking consciousness with the mysteries of nature. As God is everywhere and the individuation of his spirit can also be found in rocks, in caves, in forests, in rivers, and in animals. Bengu, a Southern African critic, makes a similar point when he argues that, and I quote, "Our status as creatures is interconnected with the existence of other creatures. Our being is one minute and integral part of a unified cosmic process of being." End of quote. My argument is that African communities have tended to view the Cartesian logic that sets humans apart from animals and rationalizes the destruction of other members of the planetary habitat as a modern deformation of the world. For them, that is the Africans, the need to care for human life correlated with the imperative of responsibility to non-human animals. In this conversation, I wish to argue that the call for the centering of the human that scholars like Mbembe signal here has always been an integral part of Africa's view of ecology and are embodied in a number of their belief systems and philosophical concepts such as Ubuntu, Utu, Ukama, and Mat, found across the continent. Indeed, Africa's communitarian ethos has always been associated with this concept. Ubuntu, that refers to shared humanity and interrelatedness within the totality of our environment. Ukama, that places emphasis on the interconnectivity of humans, the environment, and ancestors and God. And Mat, which emphasizes harmony, righteousness, and the need to locate and understand oneself and one's actions in the context of the larger whole. This, contrary to the anthropocentric ideas, there is a strong emphasis on the interrelatedness or interconnectedness of human beings and the rest of nature across the continent. I wish to argue that Ubuntu philosophy, which I'm more familiar with and which I've spent time studying, rests on the principle of co-agency, which places emphasis on the dialectical relationship between humans and other species, not just persons, not just nature, but the totality of our planetary universe, which among many African societies will also include relationship with ancestors and a supreme being or supreme beings. The point is that when we talk about interrelatedness, we require a corresponding philosophical approach that looks at nature in its totality, and Ubuntu would seem to offer that vision. Magobe Ramose, one of the leading scholars of Ubuntu in South Africa, tells us that Ubuntu in its essence is the capacity to perceive, and I quote, being or the universe as a complex wholeness involving a multi-layered and incessant interaction of all entities, end of quote. The non-human is not excluded from the wholeness, and that, I quote, caring for one another is the fulfillment of the natural duty to care for the physical nature as well, especially because Ubuntu, here he says, is the constant strive to strike and maintain a balance between beings and physical nature. In a fundamental way, Ramose's position echoes back to a pre-colonial metaphysics of nature in which the emphasis was always on achieving a balance, striving for harmony, and a productive coexistence between species. The traditional African metaphysical outlook implies recognition and acceptance of interdependence and peaceful coexistence between earth, plants, animals, humans, and land, including non-inanimate objects. Whenever this balance was upset, there was always a form of restitution, an attempt to reconcile the human back to their environment, either through ritual and sacrifice or penalty. Over the years, humans have mistakenly replaced their responsibility over the earth as co-creators and have instead sought to impose its authority over all species and objects on earth. It is this artificial hierarchy that traditional concepts such as Ubuntu allows us to disrupt. Benes Bujo, a Central African theologian, asserts that, and I quote, the African is convinced that all things in the cosmos are interconnected. All natural forces depend on each other so that human beings can live in harmony only in and with the whole nature, end of quote. This view of Ubuntu is supported by another scholar, Murove, who argues that Ubuntu is indeed an existential reality that permeates everything that exists. Murove also points out that in African beliefs, I quote, there inheres conviction that Ubuntu person was not only related to the other Ubuntu people, she also related to the natural environment. End of quote. It is therefore not surprising that the concept of Ubuntu extends beyond interpersonal interactions into a range of relations between humans and nature that are fundamental in Nguni cosmology. Harriet Gubane argues that the Zulu believe that there is a special relationship between a person and its environment, that plant and animal life somehow affect the environment. She continues, besides, a Zulu conceives of good health, not only as consisting of a healthy body, but as a healthy situation of everything that concerns him. Good health means the harmonious working and coordination of the universe, end of quote. Gobane continues to argue that when balance is lost, order is restored through what the Zulus call ukuzilungiza, which implies reinstating a moral order, providing a kind of symmetry which denotes that things are coming together. Therefore, the critique of Western ontological dualism stems from this ecologically complex architecture that disrupts the nature-culture dichotomy, and one which Ubuntu, at its very best, entails. I'm aware that these debates are not confined to Africa, and I'm by no means suggesting that Ubuntu ontology is exceptional. There has been over the years an increase in scholarly interventions which seek to disrupt this dualism, even in Western thought. That is why Braidotti, the philosopher, includes Ubuntu alongside Eduardo Glissant's Poetics of Relations, Paul Gilroy's Planetary Cosmopolitanism, Attar Bra, Diasporic Ethics, and Homi Bhabha's Subaltern Secularism. North American environmentalism in the form of deep eco-criticism, while claiming to be holistic and putting to rest human-nature dichotomy, has in fact shown the tendency to separate the history of the empire from eco-critical thought, which dehistoricizes nature and often contributes to a discourse of green Orientalism. The argument is that this amounts to a misrepresentation of past and a possible distortion of ecological futures, bereft of a history that has always been complex. Goha, for example, has contended that deep ecology demonstrates, and I quote, lack of concern with inequalities within human societies, end of quote, and dehistoricizes nature and overlooks more pressing environmental issues such as global militarization and the growing overconsumption by industrial nations and by urban elites in the third world. Goha points out that the construction of pristine, read non-human, wildness areas or wilderness areas in Africa and elsewhere in the third world, and often encouraged by Western financial agencies, benefits elite tourists rather than local peoples and positions enjoyment of nature as an integral part of the consumer society, rather than challenging the capitalist logic of consumption that creates the need for consumption to begin with. Goha concludes, and I quote, "Despite its claims to universality, deep ecology is firmly rooted in American environmental and cultural history and is inappropriate when applied to the third world." Although post-colonial and decolonizing nations have debated these particular issues for decades in ways that firmly place the human in nature, there remains a persistent concern that the discourse of nature is sometimes a universalizing one. And thus, eco-criticism is particularly vulnerable to naturalizing dominant forms of the environmental discourse, particularly those that do not fundamentally engage with questions of difference, power, and privilege. And though ecology as a concept always demands multiple acts of translation from nature to human, and from human to human, post-colonial ecology must engage the complexity of global environmental knowledges, traditions, and histories in ways that moves far beyond the discourse of modernization theory. It is for these reasons that the so-called pre-colonial model of ecology that Ubuntu offers remains relevant because of its capacity to foreground, one, human continuity, and secondly, ethics of place and belonging, but also in relation to other known species, but without the trappings of discourses of wilderness and conservation. By definition, Ubuntu's core values are opposed to North American eco-critics that still cling to what would easily pass for primordial natural purity in the wilderness, largely perceived as a retreat from the social and environmental pollution of modernity. An Ubuntu model would, for example, encourage the type of natural habitat that allows for a porous boundary between the human and non-human animal, plants, rivers, and inanimate objects. But it would also address itself to the questions about the economics of human ecology that has been a vital historical aspect of post-colonialism and which has been overlooked by dominant forms of Anglo-American environmental thought. Thus, what Ubuntu does is to allow us to speak for nature in a language that does not privilege dualist thought or naturalize the hierarchies between the human and the non-human, or class interests that are cloaked behind the grammar of nature conservation. In this respect, my position echoes that of Michel Serres when he writes in his book, The Natural Contract, that global climate change calls for new epistemologies that no longer imagine themselves as separate specializations, because we need, as he says, and I quote, a collective ethics in the face of world fragility, end of quote. In a significant way, Serres describes a kind of restoration of vanished knowledges, like Ubuntu, as a response to the important ecological demands of the global. Very similar to Foucault's call about the resurrection of the so-called subjugated knowledges to deal with these possibilities. He writes, and I quote, "Never forget the place from which you depart, but leave it behind and join the universal. Love the bond that unites your plot of earth with the earth, with a capital E, the bond that makes kin and stranger resemble each other," end of quote. I see in this the ethic of care that has been extensively theorized in Ubuntu philosophy, in feminist philosophy, and in eco-theology. And I want to argue this should form an important component for post-colonial and eco-critical thought. What Ceres writes about is at the heart of what Ubuntu entails and what Glissant calls the poetics of relations. And that is a way of responding to the fragmentation of history by conceiving of totality, but willingly renouncing any claim to sum it up or to possess it. The poetics of relations has a particular importance for an African ecology or post-colonial ecology that Ubuntu signals. An ecology, and this is important, that offers a critique of homogenizing models that tend to collapse far too easily global and local environmental issues. A model that calls for inclusiveness in difference. Indeed, a model in which human agency is decentered to allow for other non-human agents to acquire their rightful place in the planetary universe, not as supplementary objects, but as subjects in their own right. Ubuntu also points to relational interdependence of all lands and of the whole earth, thus offering the possibilities of imagining relations in new ways to order, to forge new epistemologies. One of the ways through which Ubuntu philosophy enables this is the manner in which it offers post-colonial environmental imagination, an awareness of our fragility when we act alone as fragmented lands or as humans divorced from nature itself. Indeed, it collapses the humanist distinction between natural history and human history. Finally, in trying to examine the belief in a fundamental interrelatedness between natural objects, scholars like Kevin Beren have sought to argue that this requires a certain measure of what he calls moral considerability, because, as he says, entities are part of the interconnected web of life. In other words, when we evoke the principle of co-agency, which implies interconnected web of life involving different entities, are we also suggesting that these entities outside the human agents and by extension are morally considerable? Beren makes a distinction between things of moral value and entities that are morally considerable. He writes, and I quote, "My main claim is that African thought extends moral considerability to include all things that are part of the interconnected web of life. That is, all individual living things, groups of living things such as families, species, and ecosystems, and as well as inanimate natural subjects such as rivers and mountains. Granting moral considerability to other natural entities entails a rejection of strong anthropocentrism, inasmuch as the interests of non-human nature are also considered to be of moral significance. Beren argues that in order for an entity to be morally considerable, it must be capable of being regarded as making some kind of morally significant claim against a moral agent or agents. He adds, and I quote, "In turn, moral agents must in some sense be said to have some kind of basic moral obligation towards such entity. This view implies that we should have a direct moral obligation towards entities that are morally considerable." Lowe clarifies this further when she writes, and I quote, Moral value is something that ought to be protected and or promoted. But to say that something has moral considerability is to say that its existence, well-being, interest, preference, and or some aspect of it ought to be directly given positive weight in our moral deliberations about actions likely perfected. And we see this on an ongoing basis, whether we are debating on issues, the so-called resources of common interest, such as rivers, areas, where you should fish or not, or whether we are talking about, the Amazon, there's a sense in which our moral deliberations about actions that are supposed to be taken on some of these, so-called non or natural resources become issues of moral considerability. So Berens identifies a number of elements that are morally considerable in African thought, and this include communitarianism, belief that all being possesses some kind of life force, and vital agency, and the widespread practice of totemism, which implies respect of animals as co-partners in the moral universe. Thus, African worldview regard a wide variety of objects as requiring respect or having a moral standing. This includes other living humans, animals, plants, and the dead, in the form of ancestors, and inanimate objects such as rocks, forests, rivers, mountains, and minerals for that matter. Now, regardless of our attitude towards these claims, what is evident is that African worldviews do require a certain respect for the environment, which is largely absent from the historically dominant anthropocentric and exploitative worldview that has been part of the modernist project in the last few centuries or decades. According to Beren, therefore, and I quote, what grants moral considerability to an entity is not that it has an individual life or telos of its own, but that it is part of the web or fabric of life. And then, on this view, all things that can be part of this web of life that themselves share or enable this life can be morally considerable. Thus, according to the web of life criterion, moral considerability could be extended to even geological formations on the basis of their history and the natural processes of their coming into existence. They are morally considerable because they have been forged through the natural processes of the earth alongside and intricately interconnected with the natural processes that continue to create and sustain life. It is on these bases that Beren argues that it is plausible to include inanimate natural entities within the scope of what is morally considerable. Similarly, since the belief in ancestors implies a continuity and interdependence between generations, they too would qualify as morally considerable. Since, as Weredu argues, intergenerational moral accountability is intrinsic to African thought. Kwesi Weredu observes, and I quote, of all the duties owed to the ancestors, none is more imperious than that of husbanding the resources of the land so as to leave it in good shape for posterity. In this moral scheme, the rights of the unborn play such a cardinal role that any traditional African would be nonplussed by the debate in Western philosophy as to the existence of such rights. In upshot, there's a two-sided concept of stewardship in the management of the environment, involving obligations to both ancestors and descendants, which motivates environmental carefulness. End of quote. In conclusion, I wish to state that since Ubuntu is relational and necessarily takes into account relationships and connectedness of everything in nature, its principle of coagency, premised here on what Behrens calls moral considerability, works to promote harmony, solidarity, respect, and mutual cooperation between natural things. If indeed what is central to morality is life, as in the web of fabric life, then anything that forms part of this complex web of life can be morally considerable, a co-agent that fundamentally disrupts human and nature dualism. I thank you.